So metacognition refers to the ability to think about our own thinking, literally means cognition about cognition. And I think it's useful to introduce it with a couple of concrete examples. So you imagine that you're revising for an upcoming exam. You might think to yourself, do I know this topic well enough or not? So that's a metacognitive judgment about your own knowledge, about your own understanding. And that clearly has consequences for our learning, because if we think we know something well, but we actually don't, then we might stop seeking out new information, stop studying. And that's going to have deleterious consequences for when it comes to exam time. Educational psychology showing that metacognitive assessments at a particular time along the learning journey have big consequences for how we perform later on. And so you could have someone who's actually quite skilled with some raw ability in a domain like mathematics or history or whatever it is, but if they don't have good metacognition, then they might actually underperform. And so there's a sense in which having good metacognition is this additional add-on that helps us self-regulate our learning journey.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. So today, we have the interesting question of our own self-awareness, or metacognition, as it's called in neuroscience to understand. Now, for centuries, philosophers have called on us to know thyself. But only now, with the tools of modern neuroscience, have we been able to scientifically quantify the way we consciously track our behavior, our performance, our thoughts, and our knowledge. So today, we're going to be getting into why this is so important for learning and for error correction. We're going to talk about metacognition's role in mind reading, or tracking our confidence in other people and in their own knowledge, both friends and foes, that was so fundamental to the evolution of collective groups. We're also going to be talking about whether metacognition is proportionally correlated to intelligence, which is not necessarily as we might expect. And possibly most importantly, how technology and AI has and will continue to influence the future of our self-awareness, and whether it's convenient to try programming AI to be metacognitive too, or if that would court the very disaster that everybody's so worried about. Now, for these matters, there can be no better guest than University College London's cognitive neuroscience professor, Stephen Fleming. He is the author of the 2021 book, Know Thyself, The Science of Self-Awareness, and he's the founder of the Metacognition group at UCL. He's also the group leader of the Max Planck UCL Center for Computational Neuroscience. Now, I have wanted to speak to Stephen about this since he was recommended by legendary NYU neuroscientist Joe Ledoux in episode 11 on emotions and the evolution of consciousness, when Joe alluded to the importance of this relatively new research at UCL into metacognition to help us understand the way consciousness may have evolved in the first place. So I can't wait to get into this. So without further ado, let's go. Stephen Fleming, welcome to Chasing Consciousness. How are you today?
Thanks, Freddie. Yeah, great to be here. Very well, thank you.
Well, I love to start, Stephen, by asking my guests about their first deep reflections and questions about the world and life and everything when they were just sort of becoming aware of their own thinking, usually sometime between sort of 8 or 11 years old, but it could have been earlier. What comes back to you when you think back to those first really, really deep questions?
Yeah, I think that my first encounter with deep reflection on the kind of things I now work on and the nature of the mind, the connection between the mind and the body, that really came along for me at a slightly older age, around the age of 14, 15. I remember being on a family holiday and I was sitting by the pool and started musing on why there was any experience at all, any conscious experience at all. And it was really the shimmering of the water on the pool. And I think you read this in lots of philosophy, that people are kind of grabbed by particular elements of their experience. I remember Daniel Dennett using the example of shimmering leaves outside his windows. It seems like particularly striking aspects of experience draw you in to thinking about, why is there any experience at all? How is that working in the brain? Why should mere physical systems like the human brain support any kind of conscious experience? The classic mind-body problem, the hard problem of consciousness. And so I do remember thinking through those kind of puzzles when I was probably 14, 15 on that holiday. And then that started me off on an interest in neuroscience more generally. So I remember taking biology classes at school, and there wasn't much neuroscience there, but I had an excellent teacher when I was 16, 17, who in our free periods would put on videos or lectures. Back then it wasn't on YouTube, it was on VHS tape, and we'd watch these lectures that were about neuroscience or psychology broadly construed. There were other topics as well, but those were supplementing our education with that kind of topic. And that probably lay dormant then for quite a while, because I initially intended to go to university to pursue music. I was very interested in composition, music technology, music production. And then I had a last minute crisis of confidence when I was applying for those courses, and decided instead to go traveling. I sold a lot of my music recording gear, which I'm now somewhat regretting, because I'd quite like to get back into that. But anyway, that's the way it went. Sold that and went traveling. And it was during that year that I started reading again about neuroscience, and especially getting books on consciousness. I remember Rita Carter's Consciousness, Steven Pinker's How the Mind Works. And it was those popular science books that really drew me back into the topic that I had started thinking about a few years earlier, but it had lain dormant for a while.
Yeah, it's often the way, isn't it, that those first early thoughts, we never really know their significance until much later.
Yeah.
So this story of self-awareness, or thinking about thinking, it's as old as the mystery of consciousness itself. And this phrase, know thyself, the title of your book about the science on this, it was inscribed on the Temple of Delphi in ancient Greece. Now, as far as I know, no one is sure how it came to be written there or who actually suggested it. But around about that time, both Socrates and Plato not only challenged us to know ourselves better, but they more or less suggested it was a moral and social and spiritual responsibility to do so. What do we know about the origin of this philosophical question, Stephen? And what do you think we need to bear in mind from those and other great Greek philosophers while we study this that may have sort of fallen out of focus since the very, very practical scientific revolution?
So first thing to say is I'm not a historian or philosopher in terms of the I would love to know more about how that quote came to be ascribed on the temple. I agree with you. I think that the current understanding is that we don't know quite how it got there, who put it there. But there are scattered through the writings of Plato, you can find quotes related to the importance of self-awareness, quotes ascribed to Socrates, the importance of knowing yourself for living a good life. And this notion that essentially self-knowledge is something to be striven towards, that it's part of being a wise individual. And there's quotes in those writings that suggest that it is the essence of life, to a life well lived, to that what's the point of doing anything until we know ourselves. And but I think it's also important to realize that this is not a invention of the ancient Greeks. You can when I was writing the books, I was looking for similar quotes in other ancient traditions. There's a nice quote from Lao Tsu in ancient Eastern traditions, where he points out that knowing yourself is the optimal situation, but thinking that you know things but actually not knowing them is what he refers to as a disease. So this notion of overconfidence, thinking you have the answers, but actually you should be more reflective. So I think you can see hints of this idea that being aware of what we do and do not know beyond knowledge itself is something to be striven towards, but you can pick it up in many different traditions. And as you say, the title of the book and the quote there is really prominent in ancient Greek thought.
Mm. So getting on to the main topic for today, let's start with the kind of internal, personal story of self-awareness, also known as metacognition in neuroscience. Tell us about the mechanism of our ability to track the quality of our performance and knowledge, and why it's so important to error correction and learning.
So metacognition refers to the ability to think about our own thinking, literally means cognition about cognition. And I think it's useful to introduce it with a couple of concrete examples. So you imagine that you're revising for an upcoming exam. You might think to yourself, do I know this topic well enough or not? So that's a metacognitive judgment about your own knowledge, about your own understanding. And that clearly has consequences for our learning, because if we think we know something well, but we actually don't, then we might stop seeking out new information, stop studying. And that's going to have deleterious consequences for when it comes to exam time. So there's been lots of nice work in educational psychology showing that metacognitive assessments at a particular time along the learning journey have big consequences for how we perform later on. And so you could have someone who's actually quite skilled with some raw ability in a domain like mathematics or history or whatever it is, but if they don't have good metacognition, then they might actually underperform. And so there's a sense in which having good metacognition is this additional add-on that helps us self-regulate our learning journey. And then, but it's not just about regulating learning, it's a more general feature of mental life. So imagine going to the opticians and you're asked, are you seeing the chart clearly or not? Now, that's a very intuitive judgment we can make, but it's a judgment not about the outside world. It's not as if we're saying the chart is blurry or clear. We're judging our own visual perceptual systems, how our eyes are working. We're doing that in a very intuitive way. We can sense when things are a bit off and when they might need correcting. And so people have done quite a lot of work showing that our ability to track our uncertainty or confidence in our vision, in our hearing, that has consequences for how we adaptively respond to situations where we don't have enough information. So the obvious example is to go and get a pair of glasses because we realize that our vision is not good enough. And that's a metacognitive judgment. But you can imagine that operating in other domains as well. So patients who are suffering from memory loss may realize that their memory is not as good as it used to be, and then take steps to compensate for that, to write more lists, to put up notes around the house so that they remember what cupboards are which. So there's this notion that we can compensate for physical and cognitive limitations. We can rely on external tools and aids and devices, what psychologists refer to as offloading, cognitive offloading. And there's a very intimate relationship between the ability to offload, the ability to compensate, and our metacognitive awareness of these limitations.
Yeah, and just to be clear, that it's not the same thing as intelligence, is it? I mean, you've just explained a little bit about in what way they're similar and different there. Tell us a bit more about how they need each other to improve.
Well, it depends, as always, on how we define intelligence, which is a slippery concept. But if we define it in the way that psychologists often define it, as your score on an IQ test, which is a test of logical reasoning and verbal fluency and so on, then absolutely what I've been describing as metacognition is distinct to the ability to have a high IQ score, for instance. And we know this partly because from empirical data, when you look in large samples of individuals and you measure their IQ and you measure their metacognitive awareness, these capacities are not correlated. So you can have someone who's actually quite smart but unself-aware, and vice versa. And we also know this on a more theoretical level, that if you are engaging in some chain of reasoning that allows you to solve an IQ test problem, for instance, then we can also ask people to reflect on their confidence or the likelihood of that answer to that IQ test question being correct. So people can have metacognition about their intellectual function, and indeed they do. We can measure that, and this is a distinct capacity that we're tapping into. So I think that they are, when you approach it as in the way that psychologists approach intelligence and metacognition, they're distinct things. But when we think of what we mean societally by a smart person, I think they go together, actually. So metacognition is a key aspect of what we mean as a society by being smart, adaptive, strategically aware, and so on. So it's just that the current tools we have for measuring intelligence, IQ, doesn't capture that. But I think it's an important component, just like we were talking about with the student revising for that exam. They might have raw intellectual ability, raw IQ in that domain. They might be a brilliant mathematician, but if they don't have the metacognition to realize what they need to study more of, to adaptively regulate their learning and so on, they're not going to reach their potential. And so I think that's where, in the real world, intelligence and metacognition go hand in glove.
Absolutely. Now, an important point here is that we might tend to think that our updating of our model of the outside world as we track our knowledge of it and our success navigating it is a purely outside-in perceptive process. But that's actually not true. And the model that we create of the world in our mind, our preconceptions and our differing levels of confidence about it actually have a huge influence on the way that we see the world. Presumably, our self-reflection about the world and our role in it plays a big part in the way we see it, right?
Yeah, this is a really interesting and I think quite deep issue. So absolutely, it used to be thought when I mean, not so long ago, actually. So when I was a psychology undergraduate a bit over 20 years ago, the lectures we had on perception, on vision, on how our senses work were very much in this mold of inputs coming in, being processed by the brain, and then we do something with that. So a feed-forward model of how the senses work. And then really over the past 2 or 3 decades, that model has been turned on its head by the increasing realization, both from clever psychological experiments, but also from neuroscience, showing that the brain has a huge number of top-down connections. So essentially brain cells that start at the inside of the brain and go outwards towards the senses rather than the other way around. Those two sets of findings have come together more recently in models that are often referred to as predictive processing models, where these models of brain function suggest that we actively sculpt, actively shape our perceptual experiences of how the world is. And normally we don't think about this at all. And, it seems as though the world is just presented to us. But occasionally you get situations where, in the case of visual illusions, where those top-down processes are exposed. So there's the famous internet meme of the dress a few years ago, where people were seeing this dress in 2 very different ways. And it's those kind of perceptual phenomena that nicely expose how perception is an active construction. So with that idea in place, we can then ask, well, how does metacognition get into the game there? And there's two answers to this. So on the one hand, the kind of things we've been talking about so far are more cognitive phenomena. So our assessments of memory function, of our skills and abilities. And I think everyone's a bit more accepting, if you like, of the fact that those are very much shaped by our background, beliefs, changes in self-awareness. Someone might be overconfident in their ability in a particular area. But there's also emerging evidence, and this is, I think, more recent, that more implicit types of metacognition, the automatic tagging of certain perceptual experiences with a level of confidence or certainty, literally are shaping our conscious perception of the world. So one nice example of this is subjective inflation, or what people call it subjective inflation in the periphery. So if you look centrally now, then it might seem to you that you have this visual scene that is reasonably high resolution and in color. But we know from the physiology of the retina that you have very limited color sensitivity in the periphery. And you can actually do these nice experiments. So recent experiments from a colleague, Michael Cohen in the States, has shown that if you flash images quite briefly and you gradually reduce the color saturation in the periphery, so everything in the outside of the image is black and white, then people are very poor at noticing the difference between that doctored image and the real thing, even when the black and white zone of that image gets really quite large and the color is kind of down to the center. And so what that kind of data shows us is that we have the feeling of a particular experience, but the reality of our perceptual discrimination, what we can actually do with that, is different. And so there's lots of different ways of thinking about how to explain that. So some people think, well, what's happening there is that the earliest stages of the visual system are somehow filling in that color information. But another explanation, which comes from the science of metacognition, is that essentially it's a confidence type effect. So we don't actually have that information in the periphery, but we feel that we do. And so there's a sense of ascribing confidence to our percepts, and that might be actually quite an automatic process. And so we're very interested in this link between how metacognition works and what information gets into conscious experience.
Right. And I want to come back to certainty and some of the problems that might have for bias later on. Now, just before we get deeper into sort of the more of the collective questions about this, I just want to get a few more examples from your work, because it's relatively new study, your UCL lab on metacognition. It's not a massively well-researched area in neuroscience. Give us a couple of examples of the kind of activities that you're using in the lab to test this, and perhaps some of the results that didn't come out quite as we might expect.
Yes, so the workhorse paradigm or experimental setup that we use to study metacognition is by asking people to perform certain well-controlled tasks, often involving perceptual judgments or judgments about memory, what people can remember from learning a list, for instance, or making some kind of decision based on information that's presented to them on a computer screen. And the key data point for us is not necessarily your decisions on those tasks themselves, but we then ask you to evaluate how well you think you have performed on the primary task. And it's these self-evaluations that give us insight into your metacognition. And often those self-evaluations take the form of a confidence judgment. We ask you, how confident are you that you got the previous answer correct? And when we have lots of those kind of confidence estimates, so typically we get you into the lab and we'll ask you to do a few hundred trials of these tasks, ask you after every decision you make, how well do you think you did on that trial? And then when we have those kind of data, we can build up a statistical picture of how good your metacognition is. And intuitively, if you have good metacognition, then when you're correct on the primary task, you'll tend to have higher confidence. And when you're incorrect on the primary task, you'll tend to have lower confidence. And so from those kind of data, we can extract out your metacognitive profile, and we can summarize that in a few statistics and a few numbers. And one we're particularly interested in is what we call metacognitive efficiency. So how efficient is your self-evaluation at tracking your own performance? And we can then quantify that. We can give you a number for that. We can measure it in different domains. We can look at how stable it is over time. So if I measure your metacognition today, is it going to be the same tomorrow? So we can start doing quite a lot of work on what psychologists refer to as individual differences, so quantifying differences between individuals in their metacognitive judgments. And we found that to be very useful in gaining then insight into the neural correlates of metacognition, because then we can look across individuals and ask, well, if someone has slightly better metacognition, what's different about their brains that enables that capacity? And we've also done work using functional brain imaging, so functional MRI and MEG, where rather than looking at differences across individuals, we're now interested in what are the processes that allow you to form those metacognitive judgments. So we can look we put you in the scanner, and then we ask you to self-evaluate your performance on these tasks. And we can look at the time you're engaged in those self-evaluations, how is brain activity changing? And a quite surprising result for us there was when we used these low-level perceptual tasks that ask people to say whether one patch is brighter than another, or whether a patch of dots is moving to the left or to the right. So these are quite low-level perceptual tasks. People in vision science have studied these intensively. Then what you might imagine is that your confidence in those judgments about those perceptual attributes would be somehow correlated with activity in the visual cortex, that somehow the neurons that are processing that information are also tracking uncertainty about that information. Now, that is true to some extent. But what we also find in those experiments, that there are regions of the prefrontal cortex, so a long way away from the visual system, very much downstream of this, in higher order brain areas, that automatically track how confident you are in those perceptual judgments. And that's the case not just for perceptual tasks, but also for other types of tasks involving memory or decision making. So what our findings are suggesting, and there's also nice animal work suggesting similar things, is that while the brain is tracking uncertainty all over the place, there are also areas of the prefrontal cortex where they seem more dedicated to integrating all this information about uncertainty and coming to some holistic metacognitive judgment. So there's areas of the brain that seem to be more dedicated to metacognition. That's not the only thing they're doing, but they seem to play a primary role in this feeling of confidence we have in our performance. And if you then damage those areas, if you study patients with damage to those areas, they then appear to have deficits in self-awareness because the primary functions are largely intact, but they have this inability to form that holistic estimate of how well they are doing.
Mm. Now, one other point I wanted to just check in on before we get on to the role of metacognition in our social connections and our collective learning, I just wanted to clarify a point that Sam Harris raised in your conversation about the difference between self-awareness as a brain function and self-awareness as an actual self that we identify with as a sort of ego consciousness that Harris has argued vociferously is illusory, particularly when experienced through meditation. Would you agree that we're dealing with two different uses of the word self-awareness and that the self is a sort of mere mental construct, as he argues?
So I certainly agree on the second part. I would agree that the self is a construct. I don't think there's an independent reality for the self. By self-awareness, I mean aware, and many others mean awareness of our mental and behavioral functions, our personalities, our knowledge, our skills. And I think that those components together all make up what we call the self in social discourse. So in that sense, I agree with Sam and think that if people use self-awareness to mean awareness of a specific thing we are calling self, like an object called self, then I think that this is a convenient fiction. But the components of that fiction, the mental functions, the behaviors, the personality aspects, those are all real things we can point to, we can measure them, and people do have awareness of those. And so in that sense, I think self-awareness is not, there's not two different meanings of the word self-awareness, but if you think that those things coalesce into a real object called the self, then I agree that is not a real thing we can go and we can't find the self region in the brain, for instance. This is a collection of processes.
Yeah, and I think Sam's problem with the self there is this kind of the narrative ego consciousness self. So this voice in your head that we tend to identify with that is quickly exposed to be just a sort of mental construct that we're identifying with. And while we're on meditation, actually, I understand that there have been some studies in which it's been shown that meditation practice improves metacognition. Can you explain what you think is at work in that result?
There have been a few papers, less than 5, I'd say, that have intervened to ask people to practice meditation for a number of days or weeks, and then measured their metacognitive efficiency on these low-level tasks, the kind of things I was describing earlier, both before and after. And there's hints in that literature that meditation has a benefit for metacognition that goes beyond any benefit for perception, decision-making, memory, and so on. Now, I think it's very difficult to work out what's going on there. So far, those studies have been descriptive. They're, I think, fascinating and offer a clear direction for future research. More needs to be done on this, I think. But so far, those studies have not used modeling or brain imaging to investigate what's happening to the process of confidence formation, to the processes supporting metacognitive judgments, the kind of experiments I was describing earlier, where we can actually look online what's happening in the brain when you're self-evaluating. So that work just hasn't been done. You could speculate that perhaps in this predictive processing framework that meditation is relaxing these strong priors we have at the upper levels of the hierarchy. I think that fits with the general notion that meditation is somewhat dissolving those ego levels, and that might mean that then the components of the system that enable you to self-evaluate and form confidence are, in a sense, reset a little bit. We're broken out of these strong priors that might impair us in having a more clear-eyed view of ourselves. But that's just speculation, and it all needs more systematic work to actually understand, how does metacognition mechanistically change metacognition. I don't think we have a good answer to that question.
Yeah. Okay, so widening the lens now, let's zoom out and talk about the importance of theory of mind, or our capacity to understand other people's knowledge, other people's beliefs, intentions, desires, and so on. Sometimes referred to as mind reading, which I love. Presumably, similar circuits are at work when I'm tracking self-awareness as when I'm tracking the performance and knowledge of others. And when assessing both those in my mutually dependent peer group and those in which I'm in competition with. What does the research tell us about the role of our usual metacognitive ability and that of the ability to evaluate that in others?
Yes, this is very interesting. And as you say, it seems intuitive that self-awareness has an intersection with the capacity to think about other minds, and both involve this ability to take a third-person perspective, either on ourselves or someone else. And philosophical speculation on this intersection has gone back decades, if not more. So Gilbert Ryle's philosopher in Oxford was famously associated with this notion that self-awareness and aspects of conscious experience are really relying on similar machinery that we use to judge others. So essentially, taking this perspective on ourselves gives us the bedrock to our own self-awareness. And the philosopher Peter Carruthers is a more recent proponent of this, who's argued that what we call self-knowledge is really just the same as how we gain knowledge of others. It's just we just have richer inputs. We just have more data about ourselves than we do about others. But surprisingly, there's not much experimental evidence on that intersection. So for a long time, it was really a philosophical argument, a psychological argument that these things should be intertwined. But the empirical evidence has been lacking on how these aspects, theory of mind or mind reading and self-directed metacognition, how are those two things related? And I think recently there's been some exciting experimental work suggesting that to some extent that story is true, but there might be also components that are not related. So there's been nice work from David Williams's lab in Kent showing that when you ask people to make self-evaluative judgments of their own performance, then those self-evaluations can be disrupted if you ask people to concurrently engage in thinking about someone else. So it seems like that screws you up in thinking about yourself because you're also asked to think about someone else. But interestingly, a similarly demanding task that doesn't involve thinking about someone else leaves self-evaluation unaffected. So that's quite interesting. So that suggests that there's, some aspects of metacognition that is co-opting resources that are also used to think about others.
Well, presumably this is pretty relevant for children as well, because they're so dependent on the others in their group for their safety. In our episodes on safety and trauma, mental health, with the likes of Stephen Porges and Peter Levine, we discussed the importance of assessing the reliability and the safety of particularly important, carers in the child's group before the child can then relax into the social engagement system that allows the frontal cortex to sort of gear into learning. How early do we see these mind-reading abilities kicking in the young brain?
So the classic results there are that kids pass tests of theory of mind around the age of 4. So the tests here are known as false belief tests. So the kids are asked to watch a little scene, and then one of the characters in that scene leaves the room, and the other character plays a trick and hides something in a different place. And when the first character returns to that scene, the kids are asked, where does this guy think the ball is or think the toy is? And the idea is that if they're able to represent the fact that that character won't have seen what you've seen because he was out of the room, then you are able to ascribe a false belief to that character. So you're able to say, well, yeah, I know the ball is hidden in the drawer, but he won't know that because he didn't see that. So he'll still think it's in the basket, for instance. And so that's known as a false belief representation. And kids are particularly poor at doing that. So they tend to respond earlier than the age of 4. They'll tend to respond with their own knowledge of the scene. So if I ask a small child, where do you think the ball is? They'll say, well, it's in the drawer. But they won't be able to take the perspective of this other character and realize that they wouldn't have that information. And then when they get to around the age of 4, then they start passing these false belief tests. Interestingly, children on the autism spectrum don't tend to gain that. So they struggle with taking the perspective of the other person. And that's also around the same age that children pass tests of explicit metacognitive judgment. So they are then able to also realize that they themselves don't know the answer to a question or don't have particular knowledge. And psychologists think these are closely intertwined because the ability to represent the fact that someone else might not know everything about a situation may be closely related to the ability to represent the fact that you yourself don't have all the information about a situation. So that comes back to the answer to the previous question, this kind of intertwining of theory of mind and metacognition. But what's interesting is that some more recent work has suggested that there may be implicit precursors to those full-blown capacities for theory of mind and metacognition that you can detect earlier than the age of 4. So colleagues of mine in Paris, Secuide and Louise Goupil, have shown that there are implicit signs of confidence and uncertainty tracking in babies from the age of 12 months and possibly earlier. They haven't tested kids younger than this. So the kids seem to be able to have a sense of confidence, sense of uncertainty that's reasonably accurate, but for some reason they're not able to verbalize it. They're not able to use it explicitly. And so it's less of a binary switch from suddenly gaining metacognition, and there seems to be these precursor capacities that you can detect. And similar work has been done suggesting there are precursor capacities for theory of mind and then these coalesce to enable more explicit judgments about yourself around the age of 4 or 5.
And I want to just quickly come back to that previous point about this trade-off between metacognition to optimize tracking our confidence in the group's sort of collective knowledge and that of our own knowledge, which was really interesting to hear that they screw with each other a little bit. Your colleague Chris Frith has theorized that there may be an evolutionary argument for us tending to channel more energy towards assessing and trusting the accuracy of the group's knowledge over individual knowledge, as we're pack mammals, that we've traditionally relied on the collaboration of groups for our success. Tell us a little bit about Frith's hypothesis and this potential trade-off between these, basically competing types of metacognition.
Yeah, so Chris Frith has suggested that metacognition is particularly important for social collaboration because it enables us to effectively pool our knowledge, weighted by how confident we are in that knowledge. So self-evaluation is critical when you're in a collaborative scenario because you only want to send information into the group that you are confident of, and the group needs to be able to somehow weight the contributions of the different group members. So one nice example I like to use of this is if you imagine a referee and a linesman conferring on a football field, then they're naturally sharing what they saw, but they're weighting that with some degree of confidence to kind of come to a conclusion about what just happened on the pitch. And Chris and his colleagues have done nice experiments to show that this is exactly what happens in the lab. When you ask two people to make a joint decision about what they've seen on a computer screen, and you make that a difficult perceptual judgment, then what you find is that if the two people are allowed to share how confident they are in their individual percepts, then the dyad, the pair of individuals, can perform better than the best individual in that pair performing alone. So it's truly a case of the group performing better than the sum of its parts. And that ability to perform better than the sum of your parts rests on metacognition. It rests on the ability to share your confidence and uncertainty about what you do and do not know. And so I think there's a very clear argument there that this was evolutionarily beneficial for social groups. But one interesting implication of this idea that Chris also points out is that there might also then be an evolutionary pressure on the recipient of that information in the group. So not just the capacity to communicate our uncertainty and confidence, but we also want to be shaped by the group's information. And so Chris has suggested that there might be some pressure to keep the highest levels of metacognition somewhat imprecise or diffuse so that we're open to influence by the group. So we're not just essentially like sending information in, it needs to be a reciprocal phenomena.
Yeah, we're definitely going to come back to updating our beliefs and updating our model of the world based on that collective input in a bit. But yeah, just dwelling a little bit on these evolutionary reasons why self-awareness might have developed. A question that came up in my discussion about emotions and the evolution of consciousness with neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux, which led to him recommending your work, Stephen. He's obviously a fan, and that's why I found your work and why I wanted to get you on. How sure are we about the reason that self-awareness evolved, and what are the competing ideas along with the kind of thing that Chris Frith is talking about?
Yeah, I think this is a difficult question. I think that on a Ryleyan story, Gilbert Ryle's original idea that self-awareness might have evolved as a secondary consequence of needing this deep theory of mind about the social group. So if we need to keep track of who knows what and what certain members of the group are saying about others, then it's clear that theory of mind there has a clear functional benefit. We are then able to appropriately navigate our social group. We're able to use deception. We're able to get ahead socially. And because, as we were talking about earlier, there's this natural symmetry between the brain processes involved in theory of mind and those involved in metacognition and self-awareness. One idea is that self-awareness is essentially a byproduct of having good theory of mind, like evolving the ability to track the minds of others. And I find that somewhat attractive because it provides this, clear functional grounding to why it emerged. But then again, it is also, like a lot of evolutionary stories, a just so story. It's very hard to adjudicate based on experimental data. Peter Carruthers has suggested that one way to try and go about this is to study theory of mind abilities and metacognition in other species. And you would then predict that you would only find good metacognition, fully fledged metacognition in species that can also pass theory of mind tests. Now, that, so far at least, has not, that prediction has not held up because we find metacognitive abilities in many species, rodents, dolphins, monkeys, essentially many species that have been tested. There are many others, obviously, that haven't been tested. Now, when I say that we find metacognitive abilities in those species, what I mean is we find the capacity for confidence tracking. So it's quite straightforward to train a mouse to invest more time in gaining a reward when it's confident, that it's got a decision correct, than when it's not. And that time investment tracks how accurate it was in its decisions, just like explicit confidence judgments track the accuracy of decisions in humans. So there's certainly a sense that the brains of many species, certainly mammalian species, have this automatic confidence tracking ability. It'd be weird if it didn't, in a sense, because otherwise that would cause a whole host of functional problems. But there's still this open question as to whether is that a form of implicit metacognition that's very widespread in the animal kingdom, that appears early in human development in babies, but there does seem to be a step change in human child development where it's not until quite late, even after you've gained the ability to talk and walk and you're doing actually quite complicated things. It's not until around the age of 4 that kids seem to be able to tap into these implicit signs of confidence and uncertainty to explicitly represent what they do and do not know. And that's exactly when these theory of mind capacities coming online. So there's still this open question as to whether the data on animal metacognition may not actually be tapping into the kind of human metacognition that we need to tap into to test this evolutionary hypothesis about the fact that actually human self-awareness and theory of mind go hand in hand. So it's become quite a complicated area, but I think it's a fascinating area for future work.
I can't help you can't help getting away from this very deeply rooted mammalian groupthink basis of where it all started, can we?
Yeah.
Now, another point that interests me here that I wanted to get your take on is that this primeval sort of fight or flight brain activity, where our lives may well have been on the line, much more so in the past, it presumably wasn't really a very good time to be reflecting on my performance and correcting my past errors. I think there's even been studies showing that metacognition can actually impede performance if applied during tasks. And it might actually interrupt our self-confidence and our sort of practiced flow of our skills. Hence, I suppose the reason for the flight and flight state and the much faster reaction of the amygdala, somewhat sort of trumping the influence of metacognition. As a frontal cortex function, is it right to say that metacognition is temporarily ineffective during times of threat? And does that explain the reason for this faster, stronger amygdala fight or flight response?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit upon something important, which is that the kind of stressful situations we're encountering in modern life are certainly far away from the reasons that system would need to have been activated in our evolutionary history. And when you view it through that lens, then in those situations in our evolutionary past where we are in fight or flight mode, I think it's absolutely right that you would not want to have this additional process running that's trying to essentially learn from how you are performing in that moment. There's no point in trying to learn whether you're getting things right or wrong, because that might be the last time you are performing a task, right? Which is running away from the lion or whatever is chasing you. So you want to optimize performance in the moment. You don't want to be, as you say, having this additional metacognitive process running that is really about optimizing things for the future rather than right now. And we do know that from psychological studies, there's a really nice, famous set of studies from Sean Belock on golfers, where she asked them to think about how they are performing a task. And she shows that expert professional golfers, when they're asked to reflect on their performance, then they get worse at it. Whereas that's not the case for naive golfers. In fact, it seems to be the opposite, so that you need that metacognitive awareness of how you're performing something when you're learning a new skill, because you need to then optimize things for the future. But when that skill is in place, it's well learned, you're essentially an expert at it, then having that additional metacognitive reflective process running seems to impede performance. And I don't think anyone's tested it, but I'd imagine that's also the case for fight or flight situations. So, you don't want to be thinking about how you are doing something, how you are running away from the lion when you're running away from the lion. So what we do know is that physiologically, studies have shown that when you induce an artificial stress response, so this is work from my colleague Gabriel Reyes and his colleagues in Santiago in Chile, when you induce this artificial stress response, you seem to impair metacognitive function more than you do primary cognitive and physical abilities. And so that would all fit with the sense that, like, essentially, if you're in a situation where you need to respond quickly, optimize performance, but in the moment, you adaptively shut down metacognitive function that might otherwise be useful for optimizing future performance and learning, but in the moment might actually impair things. So yeah, I think that picture fits quite nicely together.
And in terms of MRI, do we actually see the frontal cortex becoming less active in that moment?
So no one, as far as I know, has done a stress study of metacognition using brain imaging. So the stress studies that have been done are behavioral. So they've essentially used various tricks to stress people out. One of the ones that I think is particularly cruel is you ask people to prepare for a simulated job interview in front of a panel, and they get extremely stressed about that. Even though it's not a real job interview, people still get very stressed about that. And you show that during that period where they're preparing and they're stressed, if you then get them to do a task which involves self-evaluation, then their metacognition is statistically impaired. But as far as I know, no one's done that paired with brain imaging. But yes, my prediction would be, my hypothesis would be that because we know stress does cause prefrontal downregulation, then it would also blunt the representation of self-evaluative variables in those kind of tasks.
Okay, well, the reason I ask is because this sort of kind of very nuanced, sort of minutely sensitive error correction that self-awareness famously sort of sets our species apart for is really, really absent in moments of fight or flight. And in some sense, everything we've learned just goes out of the window and it's just dog eat dog. And this becomes relevant for our, you mentioned it now, this no longer primeval setting when we think about social engagement and we think about relationships. you give the hilarious and an example that I think we'll all recognize who are in relationships of you not realizing that you get very moody when you're stressed with work, and your wife telling you, and you only originally resisting and saying no, that's not true, and then realizing it was true.
Yeah.
So often in these cases, we tend to just get defensive and resist useful feedback, as our metacognitive ability is impaired by the stress, causing this sort of breakdown of the error correction learning loop that our self-awareness should provide. And it seems to me that in an ever more sort of polarized and polemical world, we might move into that aroused state of, fight or flight, defensiveness, more often than we imagine, and therefore totally miss out on a whole bunch of opportunities for learning from external feedback. Can you tell us a little about this slightly maladaptive mismatch between the historical context in which we developed this metacognition and the way in which we need it today to kind of update our beliefs, learn from feedback, not get defensive, and perhaps comment on some of these sort of unintended consequences that have come from the past?
Yeah, it's a fascinating area because you're absolutely right that modern life stress is not the same kind of stress that in our evolutionary history required this fight or flight response. And instead, this kind of stress that we're talking about in terms of the polarized world is the kind of stress that actually requires more careful thought, more strategic self-awareness, more. We want to be able to get out, in a sense, like engage and collaborate and think ourselves out of these divisive scenarios. And I think one, as you say, the irony is that these functions are, like we talked about before, when we're engaged in a stressful setting, then that's when metacognition seems to be somewhat downregulated. But the irony is that's when we might need it the most. We might want to be most self-aware when we're engaged in these heated arguments, and we might want to be more self-aware of the impact of that stressful situation on our emotions, on our performance, on our social relationships. And I think one practical lesson is to be prepared for that to happen. We can't avoid it. That's just the way we're wired. But to remember to lean more on others, to take the advice and perspective of others, like the example I was giving with in relation to my wife when I'm stressed at home. So now I'm more aware of the fact that there are these factors that can influence the accuracy of my own self-awareness, and I can then lean more on others in those stressful settings for a check and balance on how things are going, what we plan to do. But I think it's also very interesting what you say about the polarized world we live in, with social media, with arguments that seem to unfold on a hair trigger. You can imagine, and I think that this hasn't been studied in this level of detail, but you can imagine a scenario in which when people feel under attack, or when people are engaged in a heated argument online or on Twitter or whatever it is, then you get in a bit of a spiral where that emotional fight or flight type reaction to that perceived attack then decreases your metacognitive evaluation of whether it is actually strategically useful to continue in this debate, or to what extent are you taking the perspective of someone else, because we know that, as we talked about earlier, the ability to take someone else's perspective is tightly intertwined with the ability to think about yourself. So to the extent to which being involved in those kind of heated debates itself ends up decreasing metacognitive function, may create these spirals where the debate explodes rather than being nicely resolved by taking the perspective of someone else.
You also write in the book about the implications of these collective questions for how we should approach education. And I remember my piano teacher, who was a composer, saying he forced himself to teach in the mornings because the perspective of his students helped him to continue to question his craft in new ways that he wouldn't have otherwise considered. Now, there is also this idea of representing ideas whilst teaching them that helps us to question and reevaluate how well we really know them. What can this research do to inform the development of pedagogy, methodology in the future?
Yeah, so teaching forces us to explain our ideas. It's an excellent antidote to overconfidence because we see the ideas laid out, we see any holes in them. It allows us to appropriately recalibrate. And that's even before you've got in the classroom, right? So just preparing to teach, just preparing a lecture, preparing a lesson, even, when my 5-year-old comes to me and asks me, Daddy, how does a whale breathe? I'm like, yeah, actually, we need to, let's have a look at this together. I don't think I'm as secure enough on this as I probably should be. So, even before you get engaged with others, just the mindset of teaching, of explanation, helps us appropriately be aware of our knowledge gaps. And writing things out has a similar effect. Putting things down on paper forces you to see how an argument or a set of ideas is laid out, and you can see any holes in those. So I think teaching has a great symbiosis with research in this way, because, and this is the essence of the modern university, right? So the reason teaching and research are so nicely aligned and intertwined is that by being forced to teach, or by being put in a situation where teaching is a primary function, then that should have nice beneficial effects that feed back on the research, because it makes us aware of new questions, new knowledge gaps that we can seek to fill with new research. By the way, it's also under threat because teaching, especially in the UK to some extent in the US, teaching is increasingly outsourced to adjunct faculty, to teaching fellows, and people on research contracts, research grants at universities do less teaching now. So there's that kind of natural symbiosis, I think, is structurally under threat. But I think in general, I think that's really important, that people who are engaged in research and engaged in anyone who wants to have a more secure understanding of a topic, teaching is a really nice way of exposing what you don't know about it, and then being essentially encouraged to fill in those knowledge gaps. And I think that as we talked about towards the start of the conversation, a similar theme applies in education itself. So you can think of kids as little researchers. They're researching a topic, they're learning for an exam, they're finding out what happened in their history lessons, they're studying a particular area of science. All of that is in the same mode as research, and metacognition comes into the game there by enabling this reflective stance on what you do and do not know. And there's been nice research studies suggesting that if you ask kids to engage in peer teaching, so if we ask you to try and learn a topic and then teach it to your friend, then that has benefits for your own awareness of your understanding of that topic, and that should then have downstream benefits for how we study and learn.
Well, as you probably clocked, listeners, this whole idea of sort of our perception of our own knowledge, our confidence in it, and in some sense, how much we then go on to ram that down the throats of everyone else is
Yes.
quite a theme in this conversation. So I'm afraid there's just a couple more questions on this cognitive bias stuff that I want to get in with Stephen. And there's one topic here that I always like to ask my neuroscience guests about. It's the left brain interpreter phenomenon, discovered in the 70s by Mike Gazzaniga and his collaborator Joe Ledoux, who we mentioned earlier, both of whom have been on the show in the first series, if anyone wants to deep dive into this topic. So in their split brain research, they noticed that those with brain damage that affected the way their two brain hemispheres communicated invented explanations for what was happening around them, absolutely certain in their convictions. For example, telling that the doctor, the hand that they saw in their field of vision was not theirs at all, but belonged to the doctor. Of course, in healthy brains, this doesn't cause many problems, as our past experience tends to teach us quite well. But the point is that this research reveals something so important for me, that the brain doesn't tell us that it has just formed a hypothesis, a sort of best guess, rather than a certain truth coming from the outside world. And this false sense of certainty about the world causes all kinds of problems in terms of cognitive bias, as we believe it to be deduced fact rather than just a hypothesis. Why is this relevant for metacognition? Because self-awareness is supposed to track our confidence in that knowledge. And if you're not even aware that the knowledge is in fact a hypothesis, that this apparently reasoned conclusion is in fact a cognitive bias, that our supposedly outside-in learned truth is in fact a inside-out preconception, what chance does metacognition have of genuinely assessing that knowledge? Now, add into that the algorithmic amplification you just mentioned of bias and information echo chambers and this sort of modern internet information ecosystem. And we have a perfect storm of misled and maladaptive metacognition. Stephen, how dangerous is this risk for us mistaking bias for knowledge? Is it getting worse with the internet? And can metacognition adapt fast enough to handle this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating topic. And I think the first thing to say is that I fully agree with you that what the modern science of perception and cognition is telling us is that, as we talked about at the start of the show, that our perception of the world, our beliefs about the world are constructed. They're combinations of data coming in, but also our prior beliefs, our prior conceptions of how things work. And a key point is that metacognition operates in a similar way. The confidence we hold in those beliefs is also a construction. It has to work with what is available. And there's nice work showing that confidence draws on a whole range of cues, some of which we're aware of, but others which we're not aware of. So there's people doing work suggesting that changes in physiological function, heart rate, whether we've just had a stimulus that's been flashed very briefly, that had a fearful or disgusted facial expression, can subtly bias how confident we feel in a completely unrelated judgment. So confidence seems to be this construction that draws on both bodily and mental cues. And what I think is remarkable is not so much that it's that our metacognition is inefficient. It's that it's remarkable that it works at all, because it really is this very finely attuned sense of what we do and don't know. And once it's nicely formed as kids, after the age of 4 or 5, it continues to develop and become refined through adolescence. It's not until the age of around 19 or 20 that we seem to hit peak metacognitive capacity. And from that point on, yes, we have all these biases that we'll come on to, but I think it's important to pause for a second and just remember that this is quite a remarkable feat of the human brain, that it's able to not only form this very rich knowledge base about the world, but also to assess its own knowledge base. I think it's kind of amazing, actually. But the conundrum is that because these things are constructions, as you point out, it means that there's naturally going to be differences between individuals in how they see the world, because they're coming at it with their own history, with their own priors, with their own way of processing that incoming information, with their own set of beliefs. And so I think one thing that psychology and cognitive science research more generally is telling us is that it's not surprising that people have these strong biases in the way that they process information, because in a sense that's the way that's how the system is set up to process even the lowest level of perceptual information. We need prior constraints on how that information is being processed, and that's equally the case at the level of more cognitive beliefs we hold about the world. And so we've done experiments showing that how confident you are in particular pieces of information then shape how you process the next piece of information that comes along. So we've shown that when you're confident in something, essentially you shut down the processing of new information that goes against that belief. So it's what we call a confidence-weighted confirmation bias. And we've shown that that's actually fine. That's actually quite useful for the system because it makes it more efficient in cases where metacognition is good. So in cases where you tend to be more confident when you're right and less confident when you're wrong, then that all works fine. And that you don't want to be wasting resources on processing information when you've already decided what the answer is. You've come to a conclusion and you want to then act and move on. Where it becomes much more complicated is rather than integrating information about whether this is an apple or an orange, we're integrating information about whether Brexit was a good idea or not. Then it's much more, there's many more sources of information. And that operation of that confirmation bias, the fact that prior beliefs shape how we receive new information, becomes much more complicated to handle. And it's not clear anymore that it is adaptive. It's not clear anymore that it's useful. Because really what we want to be doing in that scenario is being as open as possible to all the different sources of information and try and be less biased, if you like. But at the moment, we have a relatively limited understanding of how confidence formation and metacognition works in those more complex information ecosystems. I think that's a real area for more research. But I think broadly, I absolutely agree that there's no reason why all those biases that we've discovered in simple perceptual tasks will not also be operating and be amplified when we're talking about debates on more complex issues.
And do you think metacognition is fast enough adapting to deal with this just speeding up ever more and more with the internet? We're going to get onto technology in a moment, but presumably the internet is creating such a fast change that maybe our evolution can't keep up.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's many things in recent human history that have outstripped any possibility of evolutionary adaptation. So the printing press, the fact that we are now able to travel large distances in very short space of time. There's lots of things that have affected modern life that diverge away from the evolutionary circumstances that produced the human brain and its kind of core functionality. So whether the current information ecosystem, social media, the internet, and so on, whether that caused particular problems for metacognition, I don't think we have the answers to that. I think what we need is more study of essentially like metacognition in the real world. How do people cope with information in social media like settings, and how do they and colleagues of mine are working on this, but it's extremely difficult to unpick the processes involved. So if we go back to like the start of the conversation, I was talking about experiments we were doing using brain imaging to unpick, if you like, the mechanisms involved in forming confidence about a very simple judgment, which was whether one patch had more dots than another, or whether one image was brighter than another. And we can do those experiments, and we can then actually come to some understanding of all the factors that influence your confidence in that particular judgment. And it's complicated. It's a function of the stimuli, how fast you were, the kind of response you made, your confidence on previous trials of the experiment, and so on. So it's complicated even for that very simple judgment. And the challenge is then, how do you go from very contrived laboratory tasks that allow us to understand the brain processes involved in things like metacognition? How do you go from that to real world judgments? And I think that's a bridge that psychologists are always looking to cross, but it's incredibly hard to do, because when you go to real world judgments, there's lots of other factors in play.
Well, and also on this point that you mentioned about the growing knowledge and awareness in psychology and neuroscience about this, the way we form a model of the world, that we have an adaptive model and it's coming from the inside out. Do you think that that knowledge is so slowly eking out into the general public in such a way that maybe there could be a little bit of humility in the face of this understanding that the outside world is how I see it, not how it actually is? Do you think that's slowly becoming public domain?
It's a good question. So I'd like to think it is. There have been colleagues. I mean, I know you had Anil Seth on your show, I think. So people like Anil, Andy Clark, they've written books for a general audience. Lovely books that have lay out this idea in vivid detail. And I think people who pick up those books who've never heard of it before will see the world in a different way. They'll really kind of take on board this message that things are more constructed. Now, I'd like to think that this then has some benefit for compassion and humility, for realizing that each of us form beliefs in a very history dependent fashion. But I think it's a great question. Like, in a way, like, can more public understanding of predictive processing, does that have benefits for compassion and humility in social discourse? That's a big question, right? I'd like to think that's true, but who knows?
It was definitely what Anna was talking about, saying that this knowledge can really help us be a more understanding and more sort of patient society,
Yeah.
and more accepting of diversity. Absolutely. And it brings us back to the original point that we talked about with Know Thyself, that this is about sort of bettering yourself in the world.
Yes.
And it relates to the loose theme of this series, listeners: self-delusion or self-transcendence. In the context of this conversation, to what extent can our increasing awareness of the human brain and psychology help us to be better people for our own health and for that of our friends and our family, but also for the progression of society? And on the other hand, to what extent does the clearly blind cognitive bias we've just been discussing completely undermine that project and make us nothing more than these sort of mimetic amplification agents, just doing anything but updating our outdated views and behaviors? In your opinion, Stephen, is this highly adaptive neuroplasticity of both our intelligence and our metacognition of that intelligence, does it bode well for how this will turn out for the species? Because let's face it, neuroplasticity is way faster than evolution. It happens in minutes, days.
Yeah, well, I'm naturally an optimist about the human race and the capacity of self-awareness, of flexible intelligence to get us out of situations. I think that the problem we have is really this clash of timescales, and these cognitive biases we've been talking about operate on a reasonably short timescale, that we form beliefs very, very quickly. Those then become prior beliefs for the next minute or few minutes of information processing, and things escalate and spiral, and we can rapidly get ourselves trapped in ways of thinking, of routines of thinking. And the challenge then is, how do you go from that narrower timescale where these biases that are, in my opinion, not biases, they're ways the system is set up to, as we were talking about before, rapidly come to conclusions about, you can imagine evolutionary ancestors rapidly coming to conclusions about what's edible, what's not edible. Should we move on? Should we camp here? Should we decide to pursue this source of food or not? All of those decisions are being made on relatively short timescales. It's useful to be able to shut down information processing and say, I've formed my belief, I know what's going on, let's do X or Y. The challenge is how to go beyond that kind of cycle and gain this additional level of metacognition that is operating over a much longer time scale. So we've also been studying this in the lab. So we've been looking at not only how you form confidence about your decisions on a moment to moment basis, but also how you integrate that to come to some self-assessment of how you've done in general on the task. And I wonder whether that's the kind of tension we need to resolve in terms of optimizing that longer timescale self-assessment. Because I think lots of us at the moment have a feeling that with day-to-day events and what's happening in society, I'm thinking of climate change especially, we have a reasonably good ability to kind of update our beliefs locally, but we have this, it's a very difficult task to take this perspective on how we as a society, even we as a species, is doing over a much longer timescale. And I don't know what psychology or neuroscience can offer in that regard, but I'd like to think that there may be insights we can gain about how to essentially nudge the long timescale self-awareness to the fore and reduce the influence of those local biases in essentially just diverging us from that bigger picture.
Mm. And of course, we can't really fully answer this question of, which one's going to pull us harder, bias or self-transcendence, until we answer this last question about the role of technology and particularly artificial intelligence. And Stephen, you're particularly well placed to discuss this, as you're a specialist in computational models of the brain and cognition, as the group leader at the Max Planck UCL Center for Computational Neuroscience. Without doubt, we've been existentially influenced by our technologies that we might, perhaps more so than we might admit. So by means of introducing the AI self-awareness question, I want to use a mythical story from your book, Know Thyself, that Socrates tells. And he tells this mythical story of the Egyptian god Thuth, who is said to have discovered writing. And then Thuth offers this gift to Thamus, the king of Egypt. And the king is not impressed at all, and he's worried that it would herald the downfall of human memory.
Yeah.
Introducing a pandemic of forgetfulness. And he complained that the people who used it, quote, will appear to be omniscient and will generally know nothing. They will be tiresome company, having the show of wisdom without the reality. Now, taken out of context, this story sounds like the story of mobile phones and computers and the internet. And now ChatGPT, relieving our brains of the neuroplastic load required to stimulate our adaptive intelligence. Thamus's worry about language, of course, wasn't correct, because the use of language eventually stimulated our intelligence and our knowledge, despite allowing us to slightly hide behind it and maybe trust certain masters of it without knowing exactly if they were talking the truth or not. But these information technologies really are allowing us to make a show of wisdom without the reality, as Socrates put it. Without being alarmist, what really are the risks of exponentially improving information technology on our ability for self-awareness? And could it be argued that in some way, or maybe at some point in the future, they could benefit it?
Yeah, no, it's a lovely story, a lovely analogy. And I think that here it really goes back to the conversation we're having at the start about offloading. So clearly humans benefit enormously from being able to outsource various cognitive functions to aids and devices, to be able to, a very everyday example is if I'm going to the supermarket and I have a sense of the number of things I need to get will outstrip my memory. So then I start writing a list. It's a very natural thing to do. And it relies on this metacognitive assessment that my memory is not going to be good enough to hold those items in mind. And the kind of offloading to external aids that seems very beneficial are ones that are transparent. So this is why the story about Thuth and writing, today we have a wry smile about that, because if anything, it's, writing, it supercharges us, it doesn't limit us. So it allows us to put things on the page and have this new perspective on them. essentially use the page as a storage device for our limited memories, to think through what we're writing on the page. So there's all this sense of like mutually beneficial offloading, and writing is a stellar example of that, but there are also others. Whereas I think the worry about, say, ChatGPT and other recent advances in AI, large language models, and so on, is that those devices are somewhat different in that they are largely black box. The machinery there is largely black box. We don't have that direct contact with the thought process behind the production of that assistance, if you like. So this does seem to be somewhat different to previous technology. So it's always very easy to say when a new technology comes along to essentially imitate Thamus and say, oh, this is the downfall of the human race. You know, the fact that the printing press has come along, or writing, or whatever, that any new technology comes along, people get worried about how that's going to affect our normal mode of mental function. But that said, these more autonomous AI assistants do seem to be qualitatively different, because they essentially offer not an external aid, but a replacement. So now at UCL, we have a concern that students are just typing essay questions into these large language models, getting the essay back, and it's very hard for us to know whether that was produced by themselves or by ChatGPT. So now it becomes less of a offloading aid and more as a replacement for what you would have been doing had you been using other more traditional aids like writing, like recording yourself thinking out loud, and so on. So I think for me, the key is not so much the technology. I think all these technologies are fantastic. The key is to find a way to maintain metacognitive contact with those algorithms. And what I mean by that is essentially awareness of the thought processes behind those algorithms, right? So essentially, we want to avoid this decrease in autonomy that might ensue if we have outsourced that function to an artificial system. And so I think there's a very fine line between offloading and using something as an aid, and outsourcing, which then leads us to lose that metacognitive contact and decrease human autonomy. I think that's what we're seeing play out right now, actually, in educational settings in the university. Our current sense, and I have this current sense when I'm teaching undergrads, great if they want to go off and use ChatGPT to help them think through, a problem. I often use it myself if I'm preparing to give a new talk. I might say, right, I'm thinking of doing this. How would you structure that? And it comes back with a suggested structure. That's great. So we're kind of bouncing ideas off each other and using that in an offloading style. What we don't, in my opinion, want to do is use it in an outsourcing style where I just ask it to write my talk for me. And then I've essentially not participated in that. My brain has been bypassed rather than used in a more interactive fashion.
No, so just sort of navel gazing about technology aside, let's just get to the nuts and bolts here. The question that everyone is pondering about, is it actually wise to program AI to track its own accuracy? Obviously, there was a point there, even if we are outsourcing our knowledge to these tools, if those tools are making mistakes themselves and we're not questioning that, we've got a real problem. Is it a good idea to program AI to track its own accuracy? The internet and now ChatGPT are highly criticized for supplying fake or misleading information. Presumably, they could theoretically benefit from built-in confidence tracking algorithms. But would that lead to the very self-awareness that we're so afraid of in AI?
Yeah, it's interesting. So these large language model systems are already quite well calibrated. They do have confidence tracking of a sort, and people have done studies in machine learning researchers have done studies of this, trying to ask the large language model to give a probability of its answer being correct, and you find that you actually get quite good metacognitive scores from these systems, and they seem to be improving as well. So as you pointed out, there was, especially with the first versions of ChatGPT, of GPT-3 and so on, there was quite a lot of falsehoods, of hallucinations from these systems that were essentially making things up on the spot in response to questions. And I think the problem here is not so much that it's hard to build in confidence tracking. That's actually quite straightforward. The problem is it's hard to build in effective ways of sending that information out into the world and using it in a way that can regulate the machine itself. And I think there's a nice analogy here with child development. So we know from what I was talking about earlier that confidence tracking seems to be quite, it appears pretty early in life. In young babies, you can design experiments to expose that. But it's not until quite a lot later in life, till the age of around 4 or 5, that kids gain this explicit awareness of what it does and what they do and do not know, and can use that to intuitively communicate it to others and to use that for self-regulation. So my kind of sense of what's possible at the moment in these technologies is that it's quite straightforward to have a system that can track its probability of success in the same way that a baby or a mouse can track its probability of success in a task. What's much harder is gaining this more theory of mind-like ability that has explicit self-knowledge of what it does and does not know, and then using that in an intuitive way to communicate to someone else, to the user of these systems. And so we have a collaboration with the Oxford Robotics Institute going on, where we're trying to explore what do humans need from robot and artificial systems to gain that intuitive sense of a metacognitive exchange. Like, would there be a way of engineering the system so that it's more ready to admit, if you like, when it doesn't quite know the answer, when it would prefer that the human take over control if you're collaborating with a robot system? So those questions about, not so much about building confidence into the machines, which I think is straightforward for these machine learning researchers to do, it's more about how do you set up the machine so that it's appropriately, it has this
So it's coupled. So it remains coupled with our metacognition.
right, exactly. So how do you set up the machine so that it's got this intuitive way of communicating out its metacognitive uncertainty in a useful way for collaboration and communication? And so if, for instance, you had a version of ChatGPT which would naturally say, you know what, I'm not so sure about this part of my answer, or, you know, I'm really sure about this, and but take this part with a pinch of salt, as we just do naturally when we're communicating. Like, for instance, at the start of our conversation, when I said, you know what, I'm not actually so sure about the origins of know thyself, so don't trust me on this part, but, you know, the other part in the neuroscience, you can trust me on that. So there's kind of this just natural sense of communicating our uncertainty that builds trust. And that, I think, is what's somewhat missing in these interactions at the moment with AI tools.
Mm. In my sense, particularly given the market for human-like AI companions and this race to AGI, this research will be done despite any potential risks. In your opinion, Stephen, can an artificial intelligence develop true human-like metacognition? And if not, in what way will its imitation of our consciousness be different to ours? Just to close.
Yeah, I've come on a bit of a journey about this question myself. So I used to think that it was quite difficult to build a device with true artificial metacognition in the way that I just described. That you might that building in confidence tracking or uncertainty tracking might be quite straightforward, but building in this higher order third-person perspective on how the machine is working, building in this theory of mind-like capacity, may be quite difficult. But I don't see any technical barriers to doing so based on what I know from colleagues in AI and machine learning. A lot of that architecture is known and can be implemented. It's just a question of, is it functionally beneficial to do so? So I think on the engineering side, I don't see any problem. I don't see any issues with. Don't see any barriers to doing that. The deeper question, I think, is what are the then consequences for attributions of self-awareness, and also at a deeper level, attributions of conscious experience. Now, this is obviously a very heavily debated topic, but one view on consciousness that I mentioned earlier is that being able to tag particular perceptual representations with a sense of confidence in terms of like reflecting reality, as opposed to just being products of internal simulation or internal noise, that is what a lot of us in the field think is important for enabling what we call conscious experience. So essentially, it's grounded in the functionality of distinguishing reality out there from internal noise, internal simulations, so the functions of reality monitoring. And that is closely allied with the functions of implicit forms of metacognition, being able to tag things with a confidence level. And so if you build in that machinery, then you may get a system that not only displays metacognition, but also has a strong sense of there being an external reality that is separate to itself, and that is, but that causes it to strongly to form very strong beliefs that it in a sense sees the world as it is, and falls into these same kind of traps that we fall into by thinking that, you know, that is how the world is out there. It's not a construction. And if you had a machine where everything, all that was bound up in the way it processes information, then I think you would end up thinking, as someone interacting with that kind of architecture, that it behaves just the way we do. It forms the same kind of beliefs we do. It has the same kind of intuitions about the world that we do. And then I think it would be very hard not to just assume it was conscious the way we are. So I think the debates at the moment about artificial consciousness are often filtered through a lens of the current most impressive technologies, which are these large language models. I don't think those large language models are conscious. But I also think that's not because they have some special property that we have that they don't. I think it's just because they're not replicating the full functionality of the human mind. And if they did replicate that full functionality, then they would be conscious in the same way we are. So I don't think there's any special nature of consciousness that is biological or that's part and parcel of what it means to be human. But I just think that these questions about artificial consciousness are currently quite limited because they're grounded in the kind of technologies that we are currently interacting with. And so I used to think that consciousness could diverge sharply from behavioral functionality, but I'm now not so sure. I'm increasingly becoming a kind of what philosophers call an ethical behaviorist about this, where if you had a system that is performing identically to the way a human would in that scenario, then I think we would find it very difficult not to assume that it was conscious. And I think we would be actually wrong to not do so. Then you could end up with some very weird situations, kind of explored in that TV series Westworld, where you have essentially identical agents, but one you ascribe some special essence to, and another you don't. And it's the classic Chalmers zombie comparison. So I think that essentially what I'm saying here is I don't think that philosophical zombies are possible if you take a ethical behaviorist stance on conscious experience.
Well, Thank you, Stephen, for that little comment there at the end. As you say, it's an entire conversation unto itself, and
It is.
we are certainly going to be facing it here on the show. Stephen Wolfram has already agreed to come back. Obviously, hugely experienced in using AI for all of these things. But thanks for commenting on that, Stephen, because obviously studying metacognition, you're uniquely placed to have a sense of what's going to happen, when we start giving these abilities to advanced systems. So listeners, do go off, get the book, Know Thyself, if you're interested in going further into this research. Wishing you all the very, very best with your research, Stephen, and the best of luck.
Thanks, Freddie. It's been great to talk to you.